Okay, so today we're going to continue our discussion on emergency preparedness. We are going to, ladies, we're going to talk about the basics of first aid. We're going to get into CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, in the next section. But today we're going to talk about CPR. We're going to talk about consent. Do you have to have the patient's permission to give them first aid before you start working on them if you're a trained first responder? And the responsibilities of being a first aid provider. First aid. First aid is the initial help and care provided to a sick or injured person. It's not a replacement for medical help. Just because you put a bandage on somebody who cut their leg open and is bleeding a lot does not mean they don't have to go to the hospital, right? They probably need to see a doctor and have that stitched up or sutured up, right? Would you agree with me there? Yeah, so just because you provide first aid, unless it's something very, very minor where they just need a Band-Aid, but first aid does not mean they do not have to go to a hospital. It really depends on the seriousness of either the illness or the injury that your patient has. Does that make sense to y'all? Does? Okay, cool. All right, let's see what the next slide's going to talk about. Oh my goodness. Can any patient refuse any type of medical treatment at any time? Yes. Is that a smart decision always? Sometimes when patients refuse treatment, let's say if they're under the influence of drugs, if they're having a diabetic emergency and they're not getting enough sugar to their brains, can they think clearly enough? What if they attempt suicide? Can those people make an informed decision about what's going on? Maybe, maybe not. In the case of suicide, I've handled that many, many times, attempted suicide. The law allows us, if anybody tells me they have tried or are going to try to hurt themselves or someone else, that's where I get law enforcement involved. I'll call my deputy sheriff, I'll call my city policeman, and guess what we're going to do to them? Place them in protective custody. Then who gets to make the medical decisions for that person who's basically been arrested and placed under the care of law enforcement? Who gets to make their medical decisions? Any guess? How about the police officer or deputy sheriff? And you know what the police officer or deputy sheriff is going to tell me? Do whatever you think is necessary. Do you think I've done that once or twice? Yeah. Somebody who is a danger to themselves and says they're going to hurt themselves, automatically, under state law, we take them to the emergency room and we can involuntarily commit them for 72 hours for mental evaluation to see what's going on with them. Okay? But let's get back to our basics of consent. Say a person's got a big old cut on their leg and bleeding a lot. Can they refuse medical treatment? Can they? Yes, they can. Would it be unwise for them to do so? We have something called a patient refusal form, that if a patient refuses against our best medical judgment, against medical advice, they can leave. We're going to tell them, hey, you can suffer this, up to and including death. If you don't get treated, we would advise you to let us treat you and take you to the hospital. But any adult can refuse treatment. Are you an adult at age 14, 15, 16? Can you refuse treatment? No, you cannot. I can treat you, And if it's not serious, I can release you to your parents, or I can take you to the emergency room and have you treated there, and then have them release you to your parents. Interesting, huh? What about an unconscious person? Can I treat them? Yes. There is a doctrine called implied consent. Would you think that most people would rather be upright, able to walk and talk and do what they do every single day, rather than being completely laid out on the floor, unconscious and unresponsive? Yes or no? Yes, they would be, right? So under the doctrine of implied consent, if I have an unconscious person, I can treat them and take them to the emergency room, do whatever needs to be done under that doctrine. So if somebody's unconscious, even though they can't verbally give me their consent or give me their consent in writing, I can still treat them, okay? Like it says up there, consent is implied for an unconscious person, but if somebody is conscious, we must first get their either oral or written consent before we treat that patient. What if they need blood? Then we probably need to get them to the hospital.
But what if they're double witness and unconscious?
If they're unconscious, I'm taking them to the hospital. They can't refuse if they're unconscious, under the doctrine of implied consent.
But they're double witness, they can't take blood.
Pardon me?
They're double witness, they can't.
Doesn't matter. If you're unconscious, hey, we don't know that, do we? Okay. Some of the responsibilities. We need to know how to recognize what an emergency is based on the patient's appearance, their behavior, or their surroundings. We're going to have to make a decision whether or not to help them or not. And we're going to call EMS, Emergency Medical Services, if the situation requires it. If it's serious enough, we're going to pick up the phone, call 911, get an ambulance en route to where we're at. When we train you in the American Heart Association Heart Saver CPR course, or in the American Heart Association Healthcare Provider course, you will then be trained as a first responder to know how to do not only CPR, but to provide first aid for people who are injured or ill. Now, what's one of the first things that I probably need to make sure of before I go walking into a scene where there was a gunshot wound or a knifing or something like that? Make sure the cops are there? Yeah, I'm going to do that. But what about me? What do I need to make sure of for me before I go somewhere? How about make sure it's safe for me and anybody that's working with me to be there? This goes for any healthcare job, any healthcare situation. Before you go and help someone, you have to make sure that the scene where the patient is safe for you to be there. Because what happens if you become a victim? Say somebody's got a gun, police haven't gone in there, and they end up shooting you. Has that happened? Yeah. That happens quite a bit, especially in the war-torn countries that we have going on right now. In Israel, had a friend who was an Israeli paramedic, and what they would do, they would attack something somewhere, and then they would wait for all the emergency responders to show up. Then they would attack all the emergency responders, whether it was with guns or a bomb or something like that. So, do you seriously need to make sure it's safe for you to be there before you start delivering first aid? Yes, very much so. Provide first aid, and we're going to stay with our patient until EMS or the ambulance arrives. Does that make sense to you? You're going to wait there, you're going to provide care until we get somebody that's trained to a higher level than you are, and transfer the patient over to them and let them take responsibility for continuing the patient's care. Pretty easy concepts to understand, right? Okay. When we evaluate the scene, we want to look at the possibility of threats to yourself, the patients, and any bystanders. We have a car crash. They hit an electrical pole. They have a broken electrical wire, and you see sparks coming off that car. Is it safe for you to go up and touch that car? I don't think so. Electricity scares me because what can happen to you? Not only shocked, you can get electrocuted. What does electricity do when it runs through your body? It goes from where it enters your body, say you touch something, down the path of least resistance to the ground. And what happens to all the tissue where that electricity has gone? It basically burnt up that body tissue. So from an electrocution standpoint, do we want to be very, very careful? Do we want to get an electrician to get out there and turn off the power before we go help somebody? Yeah, we sure do. We want to try to determine the nature and the cause of the illness or injury and determine the number of patients that we have. Can we handle one patient? Can we handle two patients? Yeah, we're going to get a little busy. What happens when we get 3, 4, 5, 6 patients and there's only 2 of us? Are we going to go, oh my goodness, I need some help. I do not have enough resources to be able to handle what we call an MCI, or a mass casualty incident. A mass casualty incident is something that overwhelms the resources that are available where you're at. Okay, let's say we had a train derailment here in town, and it spilled some chemicals that got 200 people in town really, really sick, and we had to get them to the hospital. We have 2 ambulances in town. Do we now have a mass casualty in town? If we put 200 people in our local hospital, do you think they could handle that? Very, very scary situation. Determine the number of sick and injured. Then we're going to call EMS if necessary, and we're going to report our findings. Okay, I'm going to stop that, and we're going to do our quiz.